So it's August 6th, 2009.
Correct.
Um, Oral history of Byron Olsen sitting before us. Um, I'm Peter Olsen, and this is the first in hopefully a series of talks with you about your life and work and whatnot, and just trying
Wow.
to see if this will work.
That's pretty intimidating.
I thought that the reason that I sort of first thought of doing this was because I found myself at the age of 47 kind of looking back and wondering, feeling like I'm pretty old and should have accomplished some things by now, and I have accomplished a few things, but I found myself thinking about where you were when you were my age, and I know that you had a pretty prominent place in a certain order of things, and I find myself comparing to you, even though we have completely different careers and types of careers. And
of course.
so, just for the hell of it, and to keep you on your toes, I thought that we could start with you telling me where you were when you were 47 and what was going on, if you can remember, and then we'll go back from there, and I don't have a real planned approach to this.
Are you recording now?
Yeah, we are.
Well, that's fair enough. I graduated from law school in 1961 on Law Day. I was the first class that got admitted to the bar on the first Law Day.
That's the year I was born.
Yeah, that's right, it was. We brought you home from the hospital in John Wash's new 61 Lincoln. He lent it to me.
Is that the most memorable thing about that day to you?
Well, after, of course,
The
getting
car
you.
that-
Hey, I want you to know that you were brought home in style. I was working for a small law firm at that time while I was still in law school. Not as a lawyer, but as an investigator and general handyman. It was a three-person firm. But where was I when I was 47? I was born in 1934.
Oh, that's important to get in there, but
So add 47 to 34, and we have 81, I think, don't we? 1981.
yeah, that sounds right.
I was at the Sioux Line, and in fact, about that time, I became the vice president and general counsel of the Sioux Line. After about 10 years with the Great Northern and Burlington Northern Law Departments, I moved over to the Sioux Line to become a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and it worked.
So that was actually a pretty big moment in your
Yeah,
career.
I was certainly that. Had arrived at least as for me, a corporate lawyer. This was about as good as you could do. Become a vice president in charge of the law function for the corporation. In the Sioux Line's case, it was I had responsibility for, in addition to the law department, which consisted of 6 lawyers, plus all the outside counsel we retained to do work all over the Sioux Line system, which was about a 4,000 mile railroad. And there was the claims department, the tax department, some other corporate functions as well. But you probably don't want to focus on the details of
Well, I don't know
corporate
what I wanna focus
organization.
on yet. I mean, there may be. I'm kind of more interested in your experience of things than about
Yeah.
technical details. But whatever you feel like you want also to
Well, let's try
lay down for posterity.
what I did at first before I went railroading. As I said, I graduated in 1961, and I stayed at the same law firm, which was Rishmiller, Wash, and Hedelson, which is a mouthful. In fact, some days occasionally when a client or person would call in and the secretary would answer the phone with that wish-washy mouthful, Rishmiller, Wash, and Hedelson, somebody said one day, "Are you kidding me?"
You want to get that?
It's Craig. Hello there.
We have dinner plans
We're interviewing me about my life. We've only got about 40 years to go here. I don't think we'll finish tonight. Did you get any clever ideas? Where Martin's is closed.
Too fancy.
Well, but those are a little too dressy. We're just in jeans and sandals. So good, attaboy.
And rolling.
Okay.
That's interesting you mentioned that because I don't think I had much of a idea of what you did. I just know you did important things
Well,
to the world, but
it
it didn't mean anything to me.
I was starting out on my career as. Are you rolling?
Yeah.
As you were starting out in your life in 1961. And well, after graduating from law school, I had to take the bar exam. Every new law graduate has to pass the bar, which is a state-administered exam, and it's a real tough cookie, and a lot of lawyers flunked the first time. So I was quite pleased that I didn't. I started practicing law with this small law firm I mentioned, and they put me right to work trying lawsuits, small lawsuits. But I tried my first jury case a week after I was admitted to the bar.
You can try lawsuits when you're not, when you haven't passed the law exam?
I had already.
Okay.
I had passed the bar and been admitted. And a week later, I tried my first lawsuit. It was a property damage car accident, which was a lot of what the litigation was that I did for the first couple of 3 years. But you picked a jury, you went through the whole drill and submitted the case to the jury and cross-examined witnesses, and then the judge instructed the jury, and they retired and came back with a verdict. And so it was all the stuff you see on television, except much less was at stake.
What did it feel like to do something? Were you scared the first time you tried to go do something?
Well, sure, there's a certain, sure you're scared, but it's a healthy scare. There's nothing that tunes you up better than getting ready to try a lawsuit, because you really have to be on top of your game and anticipate as many things as you possibly can, and you got to be not afraid to stand up and represent your client to the maximum, and that includes objecting to and arguing with the other counsel, presenting arguments before the judge and the jury. You got to go the whole 9 yards, and I was comfortable with that. I think my interest in theater and I'd done a little acting in college, and there is a certain element of theater in presenting a lawsuit in court, because you have to present witnesses, actors. You don't tell them what to say, but you tell them how to say it. And it's, as I said, there's a little element of theater in it. So I did a lot of that. I did, for several years, I worked for Rishmiller, Wash, and Hiddleston, and they were good people to work for. And I learned a lot. My first mentor there was John Wash. He was an acquaintance of my dad's, too, because he did a lot of insurance defense litigation. And he took me under his wing and really taught me a lot about particularly tort law, automobile accident law. There's a lot of litigation then as now arises out of use of automobiles.
Can we back up for a second?
Sure.
Do you remember your first trial or first case?
I don't remember I remember it was not tried in a courthouse, because the Hopkins, it was tried out in Hopkins Municipal Court. And I remember we tried it in the local high school. They didn't have a courtroom. They were temporarily without a courtroom. So, and it was a hot summer day, but hey, and I won.
I was going to ask,
Yeah.
of course.
So that was a good start.
Did you
Good
celebrate,
omen.
or do you
Pardon?
remember, did you celebrate or anything?
Oh, it wasn't that big a deal.
Was
There's
it
probably a few $100s at stake on it.
wasn't it like coming home and telling Mom I won my first case?
Oh, I'm
and
sure I
making a
did.
big deal out of it?
I'm sure I did that. I was proud, and we were off to a good start. But so I tried over the next few years this is 61 to about 1965, roughly, dozens of jury cases. I was trying one a week at least. And we represented insurance companies in some cases, defending their clients who were sued by the other party, usually to an automobile accident. I did other things for the firm too. I learned to do real estate title searches and handle real estate transactions. I handle lots of things that were, shall we say, of lesser importance, and so the other partners in the firm, I was not a partner, would say, "Barney, you take this case." And I remember once I found myself dividing the property of a couple getting a divorce, and the lawyer who came representing the other party, the woman.
Yeah. Wait a second. Okay, back up a sentence or two and continue.
I remember one kind of amusing afternoon I spent helping divide up the property of a couple that were getting a divorce. And they didn't have any children. They lived in an apartment, but they had a lot of stuff. And the lawyer who came out, my client, it wasn't my client, it was one of my boss's clients, let's put it that way. And he didn't want to get involved with it. So I was representing the husband in this divorce, and the lawyer who showed up representing the wife was a guy I knew pretty well already from doing insurance litigation against it. We were good buddies, actually. So we just rolled our eyes all afternoon while this couple argued about every wash rag and towel in their possession. But that was a good introduction to divorce litigation, which is just terribly thankless work most of the time, because the parties are
Out of their minds.
yeah, they're so emotionally involved, and they just everything's invested in every little piece of property, everything that goes on. So divorce litigation, I didn't handle very much of that. I handled some, but it was not something any of us wanted to do. It was a thankless task, because you came out of the divorce and they hated everybody involved. Both the lawyers involved, they hate the court system. Anyway.
Well, did you know kind of what specialty you wanted to, what your focus was going to be at this time, or were you sort of waiting and trying different things out, or?
Well, I was interested in trial work. The automobile accident litigation was, I like automobiles even then, and so that kind of fell right in my alley, because I could bring a lot to the table. I knew a lot going in, and John Wash also was a car nut. We used to sit around and talk about cars half the time, but that's another.
Well, I recognize the name John Wash, by the way, but also your dad was in the insurance business, right? Did that have any? Did that give you any special?
Yeah, he headed. He was head of the claims department of an insurance company in St. Paul, and of course I had grown up with him talking about that aspect of the legal business. He was also a lawyer, although he never practiced. But I did other things with the firm too, and then about 1965, I had met another lawyer, and we'd become friends, and we decided to strike out on our own and also continue to try to do insurance litigation and build a general practice.
Who, you and John Wash? Or
No, his name was Doug McMillan. And we set up a partnership, and we're at it for a couple of years, but it was a struggle.
I'm sorry, this was another guy kind of at your level in the firm?
No, he was not in the firm.
Okay.
He was a lawyer I'd met doing this litigation week in and week out. He had also come from another small firm that did a lot of insurance litigation. So we both were in trying cases against him. Met him in the practice. There were several. But we found out the hard way, it takes a long time to build a law firm. At that time, even if you were doing work for an insurance company, you couldn't bill the file until you closed the case. And that might be 2 years before you tried the lawsuit, settled the case, however it finally got resolved. that practice is long gone. Now law firms bill on a monthly basis. But we had a hard time getting enough cash flow in those first 2 years to
What does that mean?
make it. We
Building
didn't.
a file.
Okay, the insurance companies or a client comes in the door and says, I want you to sue so-and-so, and just, if you decide to do so, you open a file. Literally open a file folder, put their names on it and so forth. Take all the facts of the case, start investigating it. Then if you decide to sue somebody, or if an insurance company sends you a file and saying, defend us in this litigation, our insured has been sued, then you start the process of handling a lawsuit, but that may take 2 years to come to trial. The calendars, even then, were that far behind. And so you couldn't get rid of it, you couldn't dispose of the case until you tried it or settled it. And then you couldn't bill for your time
Well,
until that was done, the case was concluded. But at that time I was becoming very interested in practicing, going into the railroad industry. I really believed in railroads, and they were it was a bad time for railroads. They needed all the help they could get. And so I set about trying to get a position in a railroad law department. And I finally succeeded in doing that in what at the time was a squirrel. In what at the time was, in my view, the best railroad in the Twin Cities. And there were several railroads headquartered in the Twin Cities, major ones. Mergers have consolidated many, many railroad companies since that time. So I started with the Great Northern Railway in November of 1967 and moved to St. Paul, where their offices are, the headquarters building. And that was, I embarked then on what turned out to be the best, most fun years of my life, of my working career. Not that subsequent ones have not been interesting and fun, they have, but this was really exciting and a lot of fun. As I met a lot of great people. I met a man who became my mentor, Tony Kane. He was one of the greatest guys I've ever met. Taught me much, became a good friend over the years after he retired. And I had a lot of fun in the railroad business.
hold on, Dad. Sorry. Looks like
So Doug and I set up offices in the Minnesota Federal Building, which was right on the corner of 6th Street and Marquette. And we were on the second floor, and and after we practiced there for a couple of years, and then I got my position with the railroad, and Doug had to go find he found a job with another firm. But the interesting thing is that our offices are today right in the middle of the skyway that was built subsequently. So every time I walk through that skyway, I'm in between the Rand Tower.
whose offices. Well, I'm on.
Well, my interlude on my own with Doug was only 2 years, and that was a financial struggle the whole time. And so I was glad when that ended, because by that time I had decided that I really wanted to get into the railroad business. And I knew that I would have additional motivation working in an area that I had an avocational interest in, because I'd always loved trains, and by that time I'd done a lot of railroad photography, and I had an interest in the industry that was quite apart from just a job related.
When did you know you wanted to get into the railroad aspect?
Oh, I was working for several years before I got there. I was focusing on that. Sure.
Did you have a firm with Doug McMillan? Did you guys form your own firm?
We were partners. We were two partners, and we had one secretary.
Did you hang on a shingle? Did you incorporate?
Oh, sure. It was McMillan and Olsen.
Okay.
Yeah. We were a partnership. That was the common method of lawyers organizing then. They didn't have all these LLCs and limited liability companies then that law firms and other professional associations use. But I put some feelers out, and I got interviewed by the Great Northern by Tony Kane, and the vibes were good, and they hired me. And I was, as I said, that was a great moment, and it was all up from there. Well, we could start talking about that, because things got exciting for me then.
Well, I almost feel like we should do it when we have more time, but
Sure.
maybe we can use this time to, I don't know, a couple of things came up. But made me wonder how you got interested in railroads, for one thing, but how, you said you'd been taking pictures, but were you a kid when you first got interested in trains, or were you?
Oh yeah, I was interested in trains, and particularly electric railways, from the time I was 4 years old. So when I grew up, the thing I wanted to do most was become a streetcar motorman. And I had even decided that when I was in college, I had decided that I was going to, when I graduated, I thought I would just go be a motorman for a couple of years, because it was so cool. And you know, that's what could be another, well, that could have been another intro to another career, but unfortunately the transit industry was in free fall at that time, and streetcar systems were being junked all over the country at that time. This was in the late 40s and the early 50s. So that would have been a bad career choice. Not so bad if I could have survived for 20 years, because now transit is a big industry again, but not then. But, and I was always interested in cars too, automobiles. So, and those two interests have never really left me. I'm still avocationally interested in both those subject matters.
Oh, I got a call, Kim back. For a second?
September 2nd, 2009. Should I state my age? That's probably
Yeah.
it. Yeah? Do I have
What's
to?
your age?
Do I?
No, you don't have to. We can do the math.
Well, on this occasion of my having passed 75 years, I thought we thought it well. It was useful to put down some highlights of my life.
So we're going to start over, basically, even though we started this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to take those wind chimes down, even though they sound very nice. So wherever you want to start.
But can I refer to you by name, so that am I talking to you, or am I talking to the camera? This phantom. Okay.
You're talking to me, Peter Olsen, the son. Sometimes been called number one son, but
Yeah, you got a lock on that position, kid. So I should start talking anytime I feel like it.
we are rolling, and
Okay. Well, I'm Byron Olsen, Barney by nickname, father of Peter, who's filming this. And one of the things that brought this to pass is that I had been thinking I would like to tell more about my career as a lawyer, particularly a transportation lawyer. Because my son, my daughter, even my wife don't really have much of an idea what I did. And I'm reasonably proud of what I did. I certainly had a lot of enjoyable times, and I think made a small contribution to the health of the railroad industry, which is today in good shape. No, I'm digressing. Cut this part.
look at me.
Okay.
Really
Yeah.
I'm rolling now.
Okay.
And
This is an effort to put a few highlights, I hope they're highlights of my legal career, on tape for the benefit of my son, Peter, who's filming this interview, and my daughter, and even my wife, Alice,
talk to me.
who, even though she lived through a lot of these things, didn't really, I think, have much of an idea what I was doing. For years I traveled a great deal. I was gone a lot, and she really didn't know what I was doing really, and how it all added up to something. So let me start with summarizing my career, and as I go along I'll elaborate on some things. My first few years of my legal career, starting in 1961, were spent working for a small law firm in Minneapolis, Rishmiller, Wash, and Heddleson. And that was a great place to start because I'd worked for these guys as an investigator before I graduated from law school. And then as soon as I became a lawyer, I started practicing law with them. I tried a lot of lawsuits, a lot of jury cases. I tried my first jury case within a week of being notified that I'd passed being admitted to practice in May 1, 1961. I was admitted on the first law day that had been designated as such. I've always regarded that with some favor. I spent several years up until 1965 working for Richmiller Wash and Heddleson, trying lawsuits, learning the business, the general practice business, real estate matters, writing wills, you name it. I got involved in just about every aspect of a small firm. Today, the practice of law, the private practice of law, has changed. Many firms now specialize. There are hardly any general practice firms because, frankly, things have gotten too complicated. You can't do a good job for your clients unless you're really a specialist in some area. But I could see that after a few years, I could see that this was not necessarily where I wanted to spend my career. I was very interested in transportation, particularly railroads, and I began setting my sights on getting a position with a good railroad law department. And in 1967, I was successful in doing so. I joined the Great Northern Railway Law Department in St. Paul. This was the premier railroad in these parts, although there were a number of railroads, major railroads, headquartered in the Twin Cities then. Today, most of the big railroads have merged into just 6 big operations. But that's now, and this was then. I started in November of 1967 working for the Great Northern, and this led quickly to the best and most fun years of my career. At that time, railroads were intensively regulated. They were also severely hampered by that regulation. The Interstate Commerce Commission and comparable state regulatory agencies had to approve everything a railroad did, raising a rate, lowering a rate, yes, even lowering a rate. You couldn't cut your prices without permission because someone would complain that it was unfair competition. The someone who was complaining were usually the competitive truckers who were taking the business away from the railroads right and left by undercutting their prices. Well, my first years with the Great Northern were doing a lot of Interstate Commerce Commission trial work. There were lots of hearings, lots of proceedings before the Interstate Commerce Commission all over the country. I got into a lot of traveling right away, and I got involved in the industry. There were lots of railroads then, and lots of railroads with lawyers, and they sent them to all these major cases, drew dozens of railroad lawyers, and we sort of became a fraternity. So in the late 60s and early 70s, I was doing a lot of regulatory litigation before the Interstate Commerce Commission. Along the way, I became good friends with Tony Kane, the Vice President Law of the Great Northern and then the Burlington Northern, and who was a very, very capable leader, a very, very capable attorney, knew the business, probably one of the best railroad general counsels that before or since the industry has seen. And he in fact appointed me his, in effect, managing partner of the law department. We had about 50 lawyers at the merged Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Burlington Law Department. That merger took place, by the way, in 1970. These 3 major railroads and some smaller ones were merged into one big railroad called the Burlington Northern. The Burlington Northern continues today as one of the 6 major railroad systems. It has acquired other railroads since then, the Frisco, in which I was involved, and finally the Santa Fe. So it's the Burlington Northern Santa Fe today. Going strong, doing better than ever, I'm happy to say. Well, in my new role working closely with Tony, I had to oversee the management of the law department as well as continue to handle a caseload of usually administrative agency cases, Interstate Commerce Commission cases. Along the way, I was involved as lead counsel in an attempt to acquire the Green Bay and Western Railroad, a small but prosperous carrier in Wisconsin that ran from Lake Michigan over to the Mississippi River. That involved litigation with 3 Wisconsin railroads who opposed the transaction. After all, here was the Burlington Northern invading their turf. Interesting case involving everything from Cross Lake Railroad car ferry boats. They hauled railroad cars back and forth across Lake Michigan at that time. And I got to meet a lot of, well, actually I met people that I'd already met many times who worked for the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee Railroad, and the Soo Line. And the Soo Line connections were interesting because later I would go to work for the Soo Line after 10 years with the Burlington Northern. The Burlington Northern was not as much fun as the Great Northern because it was much bigger. Took years to get it really organized. And at that time, this decade of the 60s was or 70s I should say, was a very difficult time for railroads. They were losing market share. Business was going away, getting diverted to trucks because the trucks had no restrictions on lowering their prices. They could go anywhere they wanted to. Railroads were still hampered by this straitjacket of regulation, which dated back to the previous century, when railroads were the only game in town. So at that time, Congress felt that they had to be restrained or shackled. By the 1970s, trucks were hauling the lion's share of revenue. The competition was coming from all directions, and railroads were in trouble. Can you stop?
Yeah.
You need a cap?
I got one.
There's some hanging on the back porch.
Camera needs one. All right, Dad. Anytime.
We're talking about some of the things I've done as a lawyer, particularly a railroad lawyer. I want to focus as I go along here, when I think of it, on some particular cases I handled or incidents I was involved in. When I first began traveling as a railroad lawyer, I began keeping a log of every trip I took. I just took a line on a yellow pad and wrote the bare bones of what the purpose of the trip was and where it was. And now looking back on that, it triggers memories of what I was doing in those days.
Can you just hold it up to the camera?
Here's a sample page. This is 1969. I managed to get usually an entire year's travel on one page, but that was still quite a bit of traveling, 25 or 30 trips during the course of a year, mostly for business. I wanted to go back for a second to my pre-railroad practice years from 1961 to 67. I had been interested in theater when I was in college and acted in some plays at Grandview College, and I was very comfortable getting up in front of people and opening my mouth, as people in years since have wished I wasn't so comfortable. But and then when I got into trying jury cases, which happened right after I was admitted to practice, I found myself equally comfortable there, talking, and I concluded that a jury trial, or any kind of a trial, is essentially a little bit of theater, where you rough out the script before you go in, but then you modify the script as you go along. But
It sounds natural.
Oh yeah, well, that, and of course you have to adapt to evidence that comes up that you didn't expect.
Did you actually take classes in theater, or was it just doing plays, putting on plays like usual, like most kids do in school?
Well, I took speech at University High School for 2 or 3 years, which was really drama. There was a very eminent person named Arthur Ballot who was in the University Theater at that time, and he taught the University High School kids like they were college kids. I mean, it was a very mature environment, very mature class. A lot of people took the classes, and we put on several really top quality productions in the high school level. I mean, plays like Moliere and the classics. It wasn't just the usual high school fodder. Then when I got to Grandview College, there wasn't as well developed a theater program, but there were some good productions put on, and I had leads in those each year. Anyway, I enjoyed that. I wanted to do more, never did get around to it. Perhaps trying lawsuits was the substitute or replacement for it.
And it's not too late. You know, there's my friend Tom wants to see you cast as a villain in some movie. I don't know why. Did I tell you that?
No.
He's convinced that you should be like a Bond villain or something.
I think I'd fall more naturally into that role than being a good guy. So, suffice it to say that my trial work was enhanced by my interest in theater and what previous drama experience I'd had. And when I got into practicing before the Interstate Commerce Commission, I ended up being admitted to practice in several of the circuit courts of appeals and arguing cases. These are big deal cases, you know, arguing before circuit court panels on major litigation. And I was able to handle that without any big deal.
Is that a Great Northern, Burlington Northern thing, or is that prior to that?
Well, all through my railroad career, I had more major court litigation after I left Burlington Northern and was general counsel of the Soo Line, and then after that, for some private clients, railroad clients, in subsequent years. I represented Eastman Kodak for a while on some major rate litigation that they were involved in. And
transportation or
transportation, freight rates, railroad rates, and truck rates. And that brought me, at one point I know, to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Dallas for major argument with Eastman Kodak as my client. So that was a fairly hefty responsibility. So I did make the rounds. My first trip for the Great Northern, the second in command at the Great Northern Law Department, Ernie Chirinas, took me to Washington with him to show me around, introduce me, get me admitted to the Court of Claims, for one thing. That was kind of, they had litigation involving, the Great Northern had litigation involving customs cases, border crossing issues, because they crossed into Canada at several points on their line. So they had to get one of their lawyers set up to handle litigation in the Court of Claims, which is a special government court that just deals with those matters. Anyway, the Great Northern got me going on both feet right off the bat in handling a lot of major stuff, and I was appreciative of that. In the first few years with the Great Northern, I was involved in a number of major railroad industry cases where there was lawyers from every major and not so major railroad around the country involved. And these were national cases with, dozens of lawyers at the hearings in Washington, and you had to show some ability and to make your clients representation in those cases. I was involved in a lot of other freight rate related cases all over the country, and I won't try to characterize them, but they could involve anything from soup to nuts. In 1969, I spent several weeks in Washington working with two other railroad lawyers who had been assigned to represent the industry in a case which affected all shippers using railroad service and all railroads who own freight cars. And so we had weeks of hearings in Washington. That was, if I try to describe what that was about, it would go over everybody's head. But basically, this railroads charge demurrage when a shipper uses one of their freight cars. If the freight car is parked at a shipper's loading dock and the shipper keeps it more than 2 days, he has to pay rent on it, and that's called demurrage. And this was a case involving the rates to be charged for that demurrage, which were applied uniformly all over the country. I also handled intra-state freight rate increase hearings for several years and represented all the railroads in a given state. I would take a group of witnesses and lawyers out to Montana, for example, and lead the effort to get freight rates adjusted there based on what had happened on the national scene. And that was kind of fun. I got to go to some interesting places like Helena, Montana, which I brought our family back to on a couple of occasions.
Come to your town there.
Yeah.
Still very fondly.
I did do my best to take trains to these hearings around the country, particularly along the northern tier, whenever I could. These were in the final days of the American private passenger train. In 1971, Amtrak was created because the airlines had taken so much business away from railroad passenger trains that they could no longer railroads could no longer afford to run them, and they had been discontinuing them like crazy. So Amtrak started then, and that changed the world.
What was the time?
1971. These were dark days for the railroads because the Penn Central huge merger in 1968, they went into bankruptcy in 1970. This was the biggest corporate bankruptcy the country had seen up to that time. And it became evident that the regulatory system governing the railroads was grinding them down right into the ground. And eventually, by 1980, that led to major legislation which reformed the regulatory, put them on an equal footing with trucks. And since then, railroads have been prospering and growing again. It's a great thing for me to see.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, and maybe we'll come back to it, but talk about that in light of Obama's initiative to develop travel.
We've come a long way, and it looks promising. If
the regulatory thing you just mentioned, that's the same thing you mentioned a little earlier. It was left over from the days when railroads were the only option, so they were
yeah,
so
exactly.
much regulations.
The Interstate Commerce Commission and the Interstate Commerce Act, that's where most of this was embodied. First came into being in the late 1880s when the railroads were, let's face it, a huge monopoly. They were the only game in town. They were even running the river navigation out of business at that point. So, but then by 1920, trucks started to come onto the scene. The highway network was being improved rapidly. So by 1930, trucks were becoming a major factor in competition. And for a while, they were not regulated at all. So the trucks and buses could come in and take away business without matching the railroad's prices or standards of service. And it just got worse. Well, let me just scan my log, see if there's any cases in my early days with the railroad that stick out. One thing that, I think in retrospect, the people at the Great Northern, particularly Tony Kane, were pleased with my work because very early on, Tony was sending me to things that not everybody got to go to. The company sent me to an extended week-long session at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And my peers at this week-long seminar were corporate chief executives from all over the country in all kinds of industries and government officials. This was an intensive introduction to the national government as it worked then and to a large extent still works. In the course of the week, I met people like Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House. I met George Bush, the first.
Really?
He was a congressman from Texas at that point, having recently decamped from New England. He was considered a comer then, and dare I say it, a liberal Eastern-style Republican. Well, he changed. But so I was greatly honored, and then, of course, learned a lot. And I had a wonderful experience then. Walter Mondale was a senator at that time, a well-regarded senator, and he was one of the speakers one day at a luncheon. And I had been, I was acquainted with Fritz because we'd been very active in politics in those days. And I hear him sitting with all these 30 or 40 of these big gun corporate president types. And Fritz walks in the room and spots me right away and says, "Hey, Barney, come on up and sit with me." So I sat at the head table with Senator Mondale. I was greatly honored, and one of those nice little bright spots along the way. Well, by the early 70s, I'm spending a fair amount of time overseeing management of the law department, which is now Burlington Northern. There's a whole new crop of lawyers in there from the Northern Pacific and from the Burlington. Some were good and some were not so good. And it became very evident that the corporate culture of each of these railroads was materially different. The Great Northern had a wonderful culture of responsibility. Everybody down to the lowest lowest ranking employee, had responsibility for his or her work. And a railroad is by inherently got people spread all over the map. You can't have a supervisor looking over every worker's shoulder, so they have to be responsible. And on the Great Northern, it worked very well. If you made a mistake, you weren't automatically fired. You were expected to learn from the experience and not repeat the mistakes, but basically the company backed you up. You always had that feeling, and the value system imparted by John Budd, the president, and the others who had gone before him was respected. Everyone was very proud of the railroad. It did the best job. Jim Hill had built the railroad and spent years improving it to where it was the best built, best maintained, and best laid out transcontinental railroad line in the northern states. Well, after we brought the Northern Pacific people in, a lot of nice folks, but they had a management style much like many other railroads. It was a military model. Everything had to come from the chief executive, the top down, and no one dared take initiative at a local level, and it was very tough, and it showed in their financial performance. They didn't do as well as the Great Northern. I learned a lot about management from that experience.
Well, it sounds like the GM model would be much more adaptable and plastic, sort of.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, I think any management that does not genuinely trust its employees to have brains and integrity is a mistake.
It's just going to hold them back.
It holds them back, holds the company back, holds them back. I had, I'm paging through time here.
This is your travel log still?
Yeah, I'm just skimming for some hopefully interesting cases that I've done. But for a time we fought. I spent some time going to hearings fighting railroad or truck lines that were trying to get new operating authority to expand their business, to handle new commodities between points that they hadn't served before. There was still some ICC regulation, that's the Interstate Commerce Commission, of trucks. So that we went through this charade of a truck line would decide it wants to haul, say, iron and steel products from Montana to Chicago. Or maybe it'd be the other way around, Chicago to Montana. And then they would go in, they'd get a few shippers who wanted to ship iron and steel products. And the shippers were always looking for more competition, because the more competition they had out there, the cheaper the rates would be. So the more you could get in there, get not only against the railroads, but against the other truck lines, the better off it was for them. And they would profess that they had a great need that was not being met, and this new carrier was going to meet that need. It was a form of theater, but it was low grade.
It reminds me of some stuff from Atlas Shrugged, actually. They kind of go into that. Have you
Yeah,
read that?
I've read that, and I can't remember it, but Ayn Rand had a dim view of government involvement in the corporate affairs, but a little differently. But yeah, it's probably the same idea. So we would go to hearings in Salt Lake City or wherever it was, and the shippers would come in and say, we need this service, it's not being provided. And then we'd get up and say, oh, we're providing this service and that, and then the ICC would end up granting the authority, and we'd all go on to the next case. It was a futile effort, and
So they never turned down
they seldom turn down the trucking units, and even when there are other truckers opposing it. Of course, the other truckers would come and say, "There's plenty of service here. We don't need a new carrier. That'll just weaken us all." Well, that was that was not letting the marketplace decide, and which is now what happens today. We find after 1980 there was something called the Staggers Act passed, which greatly changed the regulatory scheme for railroads, and there's been the airlines were deregulated about that time. Telecommunications, some of the deregulation went a little bit too far, but that's another story.
So the Staggers Act covered railroads and trucking?
No, that was pretty much railroads.
Okay.
And it also permitted railroads to abandon lines that were no longer carrying enough freight to justify their maintenance. The railroads were a little too eager to abandon every piece of track they could it was very self-defeating because you're carving up your own network, and once you abandon a railroad line, you're not likely to get it back if some business does turn up. Fortunately, that also has changed. So starting in the 80s, instead of abandoning low-density branch lines, the railroads began spinning them off to entrepreneurs who would take over the operation. Sometimes they would lease them, sometimes they would buy them. But these entrepreneurs would go in there and actively market the railroad to the local customers and look for new business. Something that the big railroads, would cut their staff so much, were not doing effectively anymore. And that's been, since 1980, there have been some 600 new short line railroads started in this country, usually out of pieces of the big railroads, and it's worked very well. The new little railroads have almost without exception been successful, and they continue to feed traffic to the parent.
That's the kind of thing you're working with Greg Haug on.
That's right. So when I left the Soo Line I went to the Soo Line in 1978 and left the Soo Line in 1986 and went back to private practice, but I worked pretty generally on a railroad with railroad clients, but by this time there were enough of these short line clients to make it easy for me to keep in the railroad business.
Sorry, we're in 1981?
1980, no, I went to the Soo Line in 1978, left the Burlington Northern, and at the Soo Line he became the vice president and general counsel, the top lawyer, and eventually actually vice president law and government affairs before I left and came back to private practice.
Can you say more about what led to you taking the new job? Obviously it was a move up, I'm assuming.
Sure. I was a bigger fish in a smaller pond. The Soo Line was a very successful middle-sized railroad, about 4,000 or 5,000 miles in length. The Great Northern had been 8,000. The Burlington Northern system combined was almost 30,000 miles of track. Huge railroad. And in fact, it took years just to learn how to manage it. It was too big. And
that's interesting, actually.
yeah. And I developed strong feelings about things that were too big to be managed effectively, and and I say effectively by knowing the people involved, being able to get your hands around the whole system, or arms around it, so to speak. And
well, you were there in their first years when all the bugs were.
Yeah, and by the late 70s, well, for one thing, I'd gotten to know Ford Crouch, who was the general counsel of the Soo Line. He'd become a good friend. He was a good friend of Tony Kane's, and I could see that Ford did not have a successor waiting to succeed him when he retired. He had to retire at age 65 from his position at the Soo Line, and that would occur in about it would be about 78, yeah.
He was VP and general counsel, did you say?
Yes, he was the top lawyer. They had a staff of about a law department of 6 lawyers, plus the claims department, plus, of course, managing outside counsel, who railroads have to hire local lawyers all over the system to handle individual matters.
This stuff's kind of interesting to me. Like, why would there be no successor to him?
Because the logical success, he wasn't satisfied with the logical successor, who would, and he wouldn't have to appoint him, but there wasn't anybody else in his department he felt could manage it, had the kind of experience and grasp of the industry situation that I did, because I'd been working on the Minnesota Railroads Association, with which Tony was very active in, with the Sioux Line Council was very active in, and there were several other lawyers that, so they knew that I had a grasp of governmental affairs, because I had gotten involved in some lobbying work by this time. No, why I left, I was interested in leaving the Burlington Northern because Tony Kane retired in 1964 or 65, after building a cement. The merger got done. It was working. It was going. But then he retired, and his successor was Frank Farrell, who was the head of the Northern Pacific Law Department. Frank was a very bright guy, a very nice guy, but he was not a manager. And Tony was a manager. He knew how to manage people without retribution or without grudges. He could discipline lawyers, and they knew it was. The issue was only what they had done in that particular case. They were not being. They know they would continue to have a good relationship with Tony, and it was good management. It was letting him. It was honest management. Farrell, on the other hand, couldn't say no to anybody, including the president of the company, and nor could he let go of anything, even that he had delegated to some of his subordinates. And now he had a law department of 50 lawyers, and he just had to remain in. He couldn't delegate, and it was not in him. He was a product of the Northern Pacific military style management culture, and that, I'm sure, was part of it. So,
how big was his staff at Northern Pacific? It was 50 at the end.
No, it was 50 was the combined law department. That includes some remote law departments at Seattle, Portland, Chicago, and Denver. He had a staff almost as big as the Great Northern, which was, I think we had 9 lawyers, and he probably had 7 or 8. It was almost as big, but we're now talking about 3 times what he had at the Northern Pacific. Yeah. And although I got along fine with Frank, he wasn't it wasn't the kind of relationship I had with Tony Kane, and it wasn't nearly as much fun. And so I began looking around for something that might be better, and I thought the Sioux Line might be it, because it was a prosperous, well-run little railroad. It was in Minneapolis. I didn't want to move anywhere out of the Twin Cities.
What was your official title or position at BN at that time, or at the time that you left?
Railroads had lots of lawyer titles, which didn't mean anything outside of the railroad industry. It was an old tradition. A general solicitor, for example, was that was the position of that was the label you put on the second-ranking lawyer in the department. And if you were working in the commerce area, which I was, that is to say, government relations, the Interstate Commerce Commission, administrative law, you typically were called a solicitor, an assistant general solicitor, an associate general solicitor, or variations like that.
So
it just meant
stuff to the railroad people.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I was, hi.
Hi.
A good manager. You said Frank Farrell was not a good manager, but you touched on it. You said obviously you can delegate.
I'll give you a couple examples.
Okay. So, trying to include my query in the.
You got a wasp.
response.
That's a wasp that's buzzing around you. Oh, this studio is terrible air conditioning. Doesn't even take the pick up the wasps.
Okay.
You ask what makes a good manager. Well, I was learning a lot from Tony Kane, and essentially Tony was always very direct and forthright with his troops, his lawyers and other people working for him, about what he expected from them, and then but then it was up to them to perform. He wasn't going to look over their shoulder or ask them every 10 minutes about how it was going. One way he kept track of what was going on in the department is, during those days, word processing and computers had not arrived on people's desktops, but we had IBM Selectric typewriters. So they could produce lots of paper, and they would produce, all the secretaries would produce an extra carbon of every piece of correspondence they worked on every day, and they would all be clipped together and put on Tony's desk. So on the first thing in the morning, he would come in and he'd flip through the correspondence that had gone out the day before from everybody. And it just gave him a feel for what was going on. And if he saw something he didn't understand, he would go down and ask the lawyer about it. He kept up that way. He kept on top of things. Well, sometimes after I became his kind of his right-hand man, I had an office right next to his. And sometimes in the morning he would come storming out of his office. He was a bull of a guy. I would say he was leaning forward, and he'd have the thin sheets in his hand, and there would be a thundercloud over his brow, and he would go stomping down the line of lawyers' offices, and the change in his pockets and his keys were jingling, and we could all hear him coming. And I said, well, I wonder who's going to get their fanny chewed this morning. And then pretty soon he would come back, and he'd often stick his head in my door, and with a big grin on his face, say, well, I chewed his ass. And that was it. There was the grudge stopped. There was no grudge. The discipline stopped there. And frankly, when he complained about what you'd done in a letter or couldn't explain it adequately to him, he was usually right. He knew what the hell he was doing.
Were you ever on the receiving end of these?
Oh, sure. Sometimes he chewed me too, but it was very evident that he was not going to be bearing a grudge.
Hey, Mom. Okay, go ahead.
One of Tony's other rules of thumb was that he didn't think letters should be more than a page and a half long, because he kept telling us they don't get read if they're longer than that. And of course, lawyers love to write long epistles where they say everything 3 times, and they write briefs that way, and in later years it drove me nuts to have to read that crap. You should be able to write something down clearly, concisely, and say it once. Well, lawyers, but don't get me started.
Well,
anyway, Tony made a great effort to make better writers of us all. He got a famous book called The Elements of Style, which and gave us each a copy and said, read it. He expected us to follow the dictates of that, and there's a lot of good advice for both concise communication and good writing in there. So he was a man of letters and a functional, good, effective communicator.
Okay. It sounds like part of that was trust. You didn't have to guess you didn't have to wonder what he was doing or thinking about you, or
Yeah.
it sounds like it was all on the table. I think part of what's interesting about that too is what I know became a problem later at the Sioux Line, which
Well, that was a different type of problem, yeah.
Yeah,
But
not the same.
yeah, it was there was an evil jerk there.
yeah. Well, we got to talk about that too, but we can when the time comes.
But when Farrell took over, and he was always pleasant, but you were not getting what he really thought much of the time. And he was not, it's hard to characterize him, but it was not effective management, and you didn't know where you were going with things. You didn't know whether there was a problem with it, because the communication was not direct or just not there. Well, my work by the mid-'70s was moving into more and more environmental issues, and bigger litigation. I see here there was a series of litigation going on with the Colorado and Wyoming, which was a small railroad in Colorado, but it was owned by CF&I Steel Company, a major corporate force then in Colorado. And that was my first exposure, incidentally, to the area where we now have built a cabin down in Walsenburg. But I spent a lot of time out in Denver and other places up and down the Front Range and working on that litigation, along with 2 or 3 other lawyers from other railroads who were on the same side as I was. These bigger cases got to be pretty interesting. So by the railroads, the only way a railroad could get more market share in those days was to merge with other railroads. That's led a great spate of mergers throughout the 60s and 70s, of which the Burlington Northern merger was one of the biggest and one of the earliest. So in the middle 70s, the Burlington Northern wanted to merge with the Frisco Railroad, which was a regional carrier in the Midwest that ran from Texas to St. Louis, as far east as Pensacola and Mobile. It had a lot of business. It was a good railroad down in the southern part of the Midwest, that is to say Texas, Louisiana. And the reason for that was that Lou Mink was then the chairman of the Burlington Northern. He had come up from the Frisco Railroad. He had been president of the Frisco and turned it into a pretty good property. Came up, started working for, ultimately he became president of the BN, and then chairman. So by the mid 70s we had Lou Mink as the Northern Pacific guy, really, as chairman of the company, and Frank Farrell, the Northern Pacific General Counsel, as head of the law department. And
you said Lou Mink is Northern Pacific, but you meant Frisco, right?
Well, he came from the Frisco. He was hired to run the Burlington, but cue the railroad. That's just ambience. He was hired by the Burlington for a year, and then the Northern Pacific hired him to come up and be head of the Northern Pacific. So he was head of the Northern Pacific for 4 years before the Burlington Northern merger finally took place. The Burlington Northern merger, just to give you an idea what regulation meant in those days, it took 15 years for the Interstate Commerce Commission to finally approve the merger of these 3 carriers. We had to have hearings, years of hearings and court litigation to finally get permission. And railroads could not merge without getting that governmental permission. So by the time the Burlington Northern merger took place, we had a history of Lou Mink and Frank Farrell sort of being the competitive guys, even though there was a corporate relationship between the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern. They were 2 separate companies.
Wait, this is after the merger?
No, so this is now the Burlington Northern merger occurs in 1970, and then these 2 guys eventually become in charge of the ship, because John Budd, the real architect of the merger, he was the president of the Great Northern. He retired about a year after the merger. He had accomplished his goal. Tony Keane then retired 4 years after that, and so we had a new culture and new leadership, and it wasn't as fun. It's right on the counter.
This would never fly in an official office.
Boy, we got wasps out here.
Yeah, it's probably next time we might want to go inside. Well, we've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to just stop now.
Okay. I was leading up to something, I think, but after Tony retired and I was still trying to oversee the administrative aspects of the law department for Frank, and he wanted me apparently to keep doing that, but I could never even get time to sit down and discuss office matters with him like I wanted to do that every morning, just to let him know what's going on, because he would take every phone call that came into him. He made no effort, which was terribly wasteful. Even if he had several people in there he was talking with, if a phone call came in, he would, one of these people that has this utter fealty to the telephone. Well, I began doing more work on major, what we called commerce matters, line abandonments, and then I got involved in some railroad mergers. I think I mentioned this earlier. At one point, Burlington Northern, about 1975, made an effort to acquire the Green Bay and Western Railroad. And this was railroad chief executives, they're gentlemen. So Robert Downing, who was the chairman, vice chairman of the Burlington Northern, was a friend of Weldon McGee, who was the president of the Green Bay and Western and also the owner. This was a prosperous railroad that was several hundred miles long, although it was not clear how prosperous it was going to be in the oncoming era of deregulation. Anyway, Weldon McGee wanted to sell his railroad and retire, so we decided Burlington Northern would acquire it. But that meant we had to file an application for permission to do so with the Interstate Commerce Commission. And of course, the three competitors of the Green Bay and Western didn't want the Burlington Northern in their territory, which was Wisconsin. That's the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee, and the Sioux Line. So they all opposed and sent their lawyers, all of whom I knew and had dealt with for many years, sometimes as friends, sometimes as adversaries. Anyway, I was the lawyer in charge of presenting this case and directing 3 weeks of hearings in Green Bay before an Interstate Commerce Commission law judge, who would then decide at some point whether we should be allowed to acquire them. That was a fun experience because I had gotten to know a top Great Northern executive, Tom Lamphere. He became for a while the president of the Burlington Northern, but he was so surrounded by Northern Pacific types he couldn't really do much. But this guy had an encyclopedic knowledge of the entire BN, especially the Great Northern. He was my expert witness that I took over to Green Bay to put on the stand, and he had become a good friend. And I had many good business car rides, that is, railroad business cars, with him. He would often invite me along, and I'd hitch a ride with him. So that was a fun part of my experience in the 70s. Anyway, we fought. Sure.
Sorry. At these ICC hearings, are the Chicago Northwestern, Milwaukee, and the Sioux Line, are they all fighting to acquire it too, or are they just trying to keep you, the BN, from getting it?
Mainly they're trying to keep us from getting it, but they also had their own plan. They were going to try to acquire it and chop it up,
but it's not like
eliminate a
before
competitor.
you were lined up all trying to get,
No,
I want it, I
no.
want it. It's mostly about you, the BN, and the Green Bay and Western.
It's BN versus those other guys. Yeah. We eventually lost that case, but not because the bad guys won, but because we were offering something like $4 or $5 million, as I recall, for this railroad. I mean, that was inflation has occurred a lot since then, and that was about the most we could justify to make it a viable transaction. Well, then somebody came in from outside the railroad industry, not from the Northwestern or the other railroads, and offered $8 million for the property.
Really?
Somebody with no railroad connections at all. And we didn't even know who they were. But that was one of the beginnings of the short line movement that I described earlier. So naturally, Weldon McGee said, well, money talks, and fine. And the Burlington Northern generally was relieved because they didn't really know that was the Green Bay and Western would have fit in very well.
How much time did you spend on that?
Oh, just looking at in 1976, I've probably half my trips on this list here are marked GBW. Had something to do with the Green Bay and Western acquisition effort.
So,
And it was all over the place. Washington sometimes, Green Bay. I was in Green Bay for weeks at one point.
so it was like throughout a single year that you were working on that? About half
Yeah,
the time maybe,
it pretty much got wrapped up. We were on an appeals court. We had gotten permission to acquire them, and we were on at the appellate court review process when this other offer came in, and just sort of preempted us. But then, not to be deterred, I got involved in a much bigger merger immediately thereafter. That's when Lou Mink, who I described earlier, decided he wanted to bring his alma mater, the Frisco, into the fold. And so he talked Burlington Northern management and the board of directors into acquiring the Frisco. And I was assigned to that case as the lead BN counsel, in-house counsel. We had several lawyers assigned to the project. I was in charge of them. And also, to a large extent, in charge of the outside counsel that we hired to to put this deal together and to sell it to the ICC. This was a big deal. So one of the first things we did to acquaint all the management people as well as the lawyers with the Frisco Railroad, and to in turn acquaint the Frisco people with the Burlington Northern, they organized 2 special train trips. One was a whole bunch of private business cars and other special passenger cars, and we started out in Birmingham and essentially toured most of the Frisco. It took several days. It was a great trip. What a privilege. And I was riding in a business car, and I slept one night in a business car in the St. Louis Union Station, which was a big deal too. And then a month later, we did the same thing. We toured the entire Burlington Northern, not every piece of track, but the main parts of it, including what was becoming a major source of business for the BN. This is 1977 now. The opening of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, the coal fields there, which were the greatest deposits of low sulfur coal, low sulfur being lower polluting. So it was suddenly very much in demand, and the Burlington Northern had the tracks into that coal field. And then as well as now, it's a major piece of business for the Burlington Northern and indeed the nation's railroads.
What are the relative sizes of the BN and the Frisco?
Oh, the BN is a 30,000-mile railroad, and the Frisco is a 4,000-mile railroad. So it's definitely it's not a merger, it's an acquisition, I guess you'd say. But we fought. We had they had made some changes in the law, so there was a new law governing railroad mergers. It was tougher in some ways, and we had to get our application together and get it accepted by the ICC for filing. Before, you could file them and then litigate it, and then the ICC would tell you at some point whether you won or lost. But now you had to get their approval to even file it. So you had to do it right, and we were the first ones. So I flew down with some of the other lawyers, and we personally hand-carried it to the Interstate Commerce Commission on 12th and Constitution Avenue, and sat down and went through it, and they approved it. They accepted it for filing, which was quite an achievement. And if we had not succeeded in that, we might have had some other explaining to do. But that was in 77. The proceeding got underway, and then before long, I moved on to the Soo Line.
So you never saw the...
I wasn't there for the finish, but the merger was eventually approved, and that was a fine thing. And then strangely, some of the Frisco executives assumed important roles with the BN, and they were not very good managers either. But that was a result of Lou Mink. They were Lou Mink's boys. So there's a lot of personalities that get into play in these railroad activities. So if I lean forward, then that screws up your focus, I suppose.
Yeah, which wouldn't be a problem with the normal camera, but this...
Kind of ready to go?
Yeah.
Well, I felt pleased that I had been able to land a promising position at the Soo Line. And in fact, I was hired with the intention that I would be, after 2 years, I would become the vice president and general counsel, because the Ford Crouch had retired. He brought me over. He had retired. But there was a general solicitor at the Soo Line, also a very capable, good guy. He was, everyone felt entitled to become the general counsel for 2 years, but then he would retire. So I knew that in 2 years he would reach 65 and I would become general counsel. In fact, that's what happened. The Soo Line was a solid, responsible little railroad, kept a low profile, had built up good business. It had been a very marginal bunch of railroads in the Depression, but the lawyer and who is now president, Leonard Murray, had put them together in 1950 and built them into a very solid, strong property.
What states is it operating in?
It operated from Chicago to through Wisconsin and Minnesota up to the Sault Ste. Marie. That's where it gets its name, the Soo Line. Duluth, and then out into North Dakota to Portal, North Dakota, where it connected with the Canadian Pacific. Even then, the Soo Line was 57% owned by the Canadian Pacific, but that was something that was not very visible. Soo Line was an independent company and had some Canadian Pacific management people on the board, but the CPR did not make much of the connection. And frankly, I came to wish they would make more of it. I tried to promote them into working more together with the Soo Line and providing their financial strength and our knowledge of the U.S. market. Eventually that happened. Today, all of the Soo Line is operated as part of the Canadian Pacific. So, and in fact, Greg Haug's Railroad in North Dakota is part of the Soo Line. And it's leased. It's still owned by Canadian Pacific. But for 2 years, I sort of had to cool my heels and kind of mark time waiting for Bob Geertz to retire. Bob was a great guy, and we got along just fine, and I learned a lot from him.
What was his name?
Bob Geertz, Gehrz. And he was...
Weird? Sorry, go ahead.
What?
What was it funny for him knowing you were kind of waiting for him to retire? Or was it
No, it was all very agreeable with him. He wanted to, because he knew he had to retire, and he was ready to do that. The railroad had been his life. He was from Milwaukee. He had an interesting Navy career during World War II, but he was a quality guy. Everybody respected him, and we had a nice little family feeling in the law department. The Soo Line culture was different quite from the Great Northern and the Burlington Northern, but it was, in many ways, it was okay too, because they were responsible people. They ran a good show, and they kept a low profile, which is what Leonard Murray wanted. And
Leonard Murray is
he's the president, yeah. But then there came on the scene Dennis Kavanagh, who eventually I did not get along with and left because of, and he subsequently got fired by the board because unfortunately, I had left a little too soon. But that's a story we'll get to that story maybe. But when I became general counsel, that was the time the Staggers Act had been passed, so there were suddenly great changes taking place in the railroad industry. So I found myself heavily involved in government relations, going to Washington, finding out what was going on, lobbying in effect. And then because the Soo Line's source of business was greatly affected by this deregulation, the game had changed materially, and the Soo Line and all other smaller railroads were having a tough time. Well, we decided that at one point there was the Rock Island Railroad, a major railroad system in the Midwest, had gone into bankruptcy just a couple of years before. In fact, no, more than that. And this bankruptcy had dragged down, and finally they got to the point where the bankruptcy court decided to liquidate the railroad, that is, sell off the lines to other railroads. And one of the Rock Island's major lines was a line that ran from the Twin Cities to Texas. They called it the Spine Line. Went down through Des Moines, and the Chicago Northwestern wanted to buy that and add it to its system. But we decided, what the heck, we could make use of that line. So we put in a competing application to acquire it for the Soo Line. And that led us into some proceedings before the bankruptcy court in Chicago, in which the upstart Soo Line came in and was trying to push these Chicago-based railroads around, like the Northwestern and the Milwaukee and the Rock Island. So I remember once walking into a court session in the bankruptcy court in Chicago, and there were two counsel tables, and at one counsel table was sitting the trustee, that is the person who was in charge of the Rock Island, the trustees' counsel, and also all the counsel for the Chicago Northwestern, which was trying to buy the line. So they were all obviously in the same cheek by jowl, hand in glove. And then I had to go sit at the other council table with my people. And it was clear that where the, how shall I say it, the cards were kind of stacked. And ultimately the bankruptcy court awarded the line to the Northwestern, although they had bid substantially more money than we had, because we didn't think it was worth any more than that. Well, then later on, we got involved in another battle with the Northwestern. And in the this is after the Rock Island spine line case, yeah. So now it's moving up, we're up to the Rock Island caper, and that was the first skirmish with the Northwestern, which we lost because it was to acquire the spine line. Well, then pretty soon we got the idea, there was another major bankruptcy going on of a Chicago railroad. By that time, the Milwaukee, that's my prompter.
But it's just interesting to me that this is after you've been working with the Green Bay and Western, trying to acquire them when you were with the right?
Yeah, I had a lot of go-arounds with these guys. Well, by 1984 or thereabouts, the Milwaukee is also in bankruptcy, and indeed it's was forced to sell off its major lines west of South Dakota and abandon them. They sold them off or abandoned them, and it was very sad because it was a good railroad, but it never achieved the financial success of the Northern Pacific or the Great Northern. It was in their same territory. But so then the bankruptcy proceeding of the Milwaukee ground on, and it finally got to the point where the Northwestern offered to buy the remains of the Milwaukee, 3,000 miles of trackage, mostly in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. In other words, the Northwestern was going to buy a competitor and put it out of business, and it had plans to scrap it, sell it, junk it, which aroused a lot of ire on the part of the employees, the part of the communities that the Milwaukee served. So we got the idea that we would go in there and we'd try to acquire Chicago Northwestern. And they were kind of the bad guys of the business as far as I was concerned, because they were always trying to get rid of trackage. Their idea of a good railroad was a dead railroad that they'd sold the scrap from. And that was a economic model that may have made sense 30 years ago, but didn't anymore by this time. So we had the upstart Soo Line step forward again, and Kavanaugh was by this time president, and he said, well, let's go after it. Let's see if we can get the Milwaukee. And of course, the Chicago Railroad establishment, all these, the bankruptcy of the Milwaukee was venued in Chicago. The trustee was a former governor of Illinois, Ogilvie. And they were hand in glove again with the Northwestern. It was a sweetheart deal. The Northwestern was going to take over, and that was going to be the end of the bankruptcy and the Milwaukee. Well, then we come in and say, well, we want to buy it. So we got into a bidding contest. And I don't know how Kavanaugh on the board did it, but we bid at $500 million to buy the Milwaukee's railroad assets. And that was a lot of money. And this was not a merger in the sense of exchanging stock. We were buying assets, we didn't want to buy any of the non-railroad assets. And the Milwaukee had a lot of land and other holdings that eventually had to get peeled apart from the railroad. Well, the Northwestern was just outraged that we would come and have the temerity to come into the Chicago club room and try to beat them out of this railroad. So they raised their bid to $700 million. And we said, no, we're not going to match that. It's not worth it. But our our proposal is better because it's in the public interest. And there's a unique phrase in the railroad bankruptcy statutes. It's not in any other bankruptcy statutes that apply to any other form of business. The public interest must be considered by the bankruptcy judge in making any awards. You know, it's not just the interests of the shareholders and the creditors and the employees, it's the public interest must also be considered. It's in the statute. This is in the statute. And it's there's a unique chapter of the bankruptcy code that just deals with railroads, and that's where it is. So basically, we got approval of the Interstate Commerce Commission for Sioux Line to acquire it, as well as the Northwestern. They both got, whoever the bankruptcy judge decided to award it to, it was okay with the ICC either way. Well, all this boiled down to, remember now the Sioux Line has $200 million less on the table. And of course the Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation, which is the holding company of the Milwaukee Railroad, they're opposed to the Sioux Line bid because they want more money. The employees support it because we're gonna keep all of the Milwaukee Railroad that remains, and the Northwestern's going to abandon it all. It all boiled down to a final argument before the federal judge, bankruptcy judge, in which for 7.5 hours, everybody, each interested party had a half an hour to argue. And basically they all opposed the Sioux Line's deal and supported the Northwestern's deal because mostly it was about greed.
How many interested parties are we talking about?
Well, I think there must have been about a dozen because each of them had a half an hour. And then at the end of the day, I had a half an hour to respond to all those parties.
Jeez.
But we had a good case. We had a convincing case that the public interest, our proposal served the public interest better. And we had just a few days before, we thought we were going to go down in flames, but we had the regular Monday morning appearance before the Judge McMillan, the bankruptcy judge. And in the course of talking about something else, he made the offhanded remark that because if I had award the railroad to somebody today, I'd award it to the Sioux Line. And suddenly the jaws dropped. Sweet moments.
Okay, this is part 3 of the Byron Olsen oral history. It's September 4th. We're just going to try and get through to the present day, and I think we'll come back for some elucidation at another time, but let's see if we can kind of get through a summary at least of your career, and we need to back up to the point at which you were arguing for the Sioux Line's acquisition of
The Milwaukee Railroad.
Yeah,
This takes
backtrack
us-
a little bit, yeah.
This takes us back, this was about 1985. I had been with the Sioux Line since 1978, and by that time I was Vice President and General Counsel, also in charge of the legal and claims function of the Sioux Line, but I was also, because of that job, I was the Chief Legal Officer involved in trying to get this mission accomplished for the Sioux Line, which was to acquire the Milwaukee Railroad out of bankruptcy, where it had been for several years. And you may recall, or we previously talked about, there was a lot of opposition from other railroads who also wanted the Milwaukee, but for different reasons. The real villain of the piece was the Chicago and Northwestern, and they wanted to acquire the Milwaukee because it was a competitor, and they intended to get rid of it. So,
Let's hold on. Go ahead,
well,
please continue.
I was backgrounding my position or situation at the Sioux Line. I was now a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and it was fun from that standpoint. Had a good law department, good railroad. We're dealing with a lot of adverse economic changes because brought about by deregulation. We'll talk more about that probably elsewhere in this tape. But also, I'm starting to have trouble with the president of the company, Dennis Kavanaugh, who is, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this tape with that. It was an unfortunate situation, but basically Kavanaugh became very suspicious of anyone on his staff that he perceived as having more competence than than he did. And so he went through a lot of vice presidents, and he was starting to give me a hard time. But nevertheless, I had a job to do, and ultimately we got the job done. So this brings us to this day in 1985. We're presenting arguments before the federal district judge, who's the bankruptcy judge. His name is Judge McMillan, and he had been overseeing the reorganization, the whole bankruptcy proceeding of the Milwaukee Railroad for several years. And there were some heavy hitters involved in this. I should be looking at you, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that was before you were even trying to acquire it. He had been involved with the bankruptcy.
Correct. It's a former Governor Ogilvie of Illinois, who he was a well-known figure in Chicago and in Chicago railroad circles and political circles. He had been involved in the bankruptcy proceeding for some years. In the process of that, they had taken several thousand miles of the Milwaukee Railroad and basically abandoned it or got rid of it. The Milwaukee used to run all the way to Seattle. They had chopped that off basically at South Dakota and made it a Midwestern regional railroad again. And we're trying to make it profitable and eventually find a buyer for it. Well, so now that suddenly they had several buyers. A Grand Trunk Western, which is a Canadian-owned railroad, was the first one to step up and say, we'd like to take it over, but we don't want to pay anything for it. Then the Northwestern stepped up and said, we'll buy it. And then finally the Soo Line stepped up and started bidding against the Northwestern. So finally we're down to the final act of this interesting drama involving a lot of lawyers, a lot of railroad talent in Chicago and elsewhere. Other railroads were involved. The Soo Line has $500 million on the table. The Northwestern has a $700 million bid, which you would think would outbid the Soo Lines, but for one factor, one provision in the Railroad Bankruptcy Act, which is the public interest must be considered. And in a nutshell, the Northwestern was going to basically chop up the Milwaukee and throw it away. The Soo Line was going to add it to its system and continue operating the entire system. So clearly, from the standpoint of the public who are served by the railroad, the employees who work for the railroad, ours was the better deal. We were on the side of the angels. But the question is, could we convince the judge of this?
And then you had the shareholders of Milwaukee against you too, basically.
There were several interest groups. Mostly their interest was financial. The Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation was basically the owners of the Milwaukee, stockholders, if you will, and they wanted to get as much money as they could for it and get out of the railroad business and get on to spending money and whatever money they could get out of it. And I think I described this, and maybe this won't, well, it's worth describing again. We had an all-day argument in federal court in Chicago, and each faction involved in the case was allotted a half an hour to present what they thought should happen. Should the Milwaukee be sold to the Northwestern? Should the Milwaukee be sold to the Soo Line? Should it be sold to the Grand Trunk? Or should some other disposition be made of it? The employees were one group. They had a half an hour. The CMC Corporation, Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation, they had half an hour. The Northwestern had time. Other railroads had time. By the end, there were 7 or 7.5 hours of argument were allotted to other parties, most of whom were opposed to the Soo Line and in favor of the Northwestern. And then finally, at the end of the day, I had a half an hour to respond to all of these arguments and to make the case for the Soo Line.
Was it dispiriting to hear all these people just like
No,
trashing
we knew we know going in what they were going to say. They'd said it many times before. We'd had lots of court hearings, but this was the big one. The judge was going to decide after he heard our arguments who should get the railroad. And and I'm trying to remember one point.
Take your time.
The judge had already signaled for the first time just a few days before that he was leaning our way, that he was inclined to favor the Soo line. And there's a little anecdote that kind of signals this. The trustee had taken the judge for a train ride on the Milwaukee down the river some months before. And while they were cruising down the river with an open platform business car, the judge had seen a bald eagle. And then the judge had immediately been told that, but we're going to abandon this line. If the Northwestern gets this, is successful, this is going to be abandoned. So many of us thought that the judge probably remembered that.
Wasn't that taken for granted during the proceedings that they were going to abandon that, or were they pretending they weren't?
No, they were, but we were not going to abandon it.
Yeah.
In fact, the line is still running. All the Milwaukee River lines are still in operation and hauling a lot of freight now, and as well as passengers. Well, I really look forward to this argument, and I had a lot of fun with it because I've never had a major argument in a appellate court, which is kind of what this was like, where the judge listened more closely to what I was saying. That was fun, and one of the key arguments that I made, we had a chart which showed the relative size of the Northwestern if it acquired the Milwaukee, and the relative size of the Soo line and if it acquired the Milwaukee compared to the other competing railroads in Wisconsin. And basically what it showed that if the Northwestern acquired the Milwaukee, it would have been a huge railroad and it would have dwarfed everybody else. It would have been bad for competition, obviously, just on the face of that. But if the Soo line acquired the Milwaukee, it would be about the same size as the Northwestern was already. So it would be a nice balance, and there were some other carriers in there. So that was a very compelling exhibit. Well, I finished my argument, and the judge said, we'll reconvene tomorrow morning and I will deliver my opinion from the bench. And so we all gathered the next morning, and the judge proceeded to deliver his opinion. It was like he had taken my argument and just rephrased it. He took every one of my points, the points we had presented through me, and agreed with them and made them part of his findings. And ultimately, the next day, he delivered a written opinion which did the same thing. It was so fun, so rewarding. But on the other hand, Dennis Kavanaugh, my boss, who really wanted to get this done, he didn't even come to the argument, which was shabby. I mean, everybody else and his brother interested in the case was there. There were hundreds of people in the courtroom, so it was a big deal, and it came out fine.
Sounds like it came out better than as good as it could have.
So we closed the deal. The judge announced his approval this was in February, as I recall, and delivered his written opinion, and the Northwestern, showing that it had not much stomach for ponying up with $700 million anyway, announced that it was withdrawing from the proceeding. It would not appeal. And so within a week, I think it was within a week, we closed the deal. We had an all-night closing with lawyers running around. It took that, since this was an asset purchase, it was much more complicated to close it than to just exchange some stock, which is what most mergers do. But we got it done, and we owned the railroad. I then worked for another year.
It's up to you. I'm rolling.
It was a very satisfying experience personally because, for one thing, we'd been beaten by the Northwestern just a year or two before in our effort to acquire a piece of the Rock Island, which was a much smaller deal. But and this was sweet revenge, I guess you'd say. It was somewhat bittersweet because by that time my relationship with Kavanaugh was poor, and there was no real sense of appreciation for what we had accomplished.
But how many people were working with you on this case?
Well, we had hired a New York hotshot law firm, Skadden Arps, which was the big firm in those days on hostile takeovers and major mergers. And they eventually assigned an associate who was very helpful to me,
Who's this,
is
Sal?
Sal Santoro. But the other heavy hitters, they were worthless. They just kind of smiled and.
So the higher ups were no good, but Sal Santoro.
Yeah, and the higher ups basically went away before we got to the end. We
Tell
had
me-
we had other we had another major law firm that I'd worked with many times when I was with the BN, Sidley and Austin. This is a major Washington D.C. law firm that is involved in railroad mergers and railroad regulatory proceedings. And there were, of course, several lawyers on the staff and outside counsel. Marv Metke, our Sioux Line counsel in Chicago, he was very helpful, and we worked very closely. I spent many weeks in Chicago
Yeah.
leading up to this.
So what I'm getting at is there must have been a great sense of accomplishment and celebration among the people you worked with. If
Oh,
not,
sure.
You know, Kavanaugh aside, and
There was, yeah. And the lawyers tend to view themselves as a breed apart in the corporate world. We know we know more than others. At least we fancy that we do sometimes. And so it was a great success. And the Sioux Line, it helped the Sioux Line, and even today, now it's the pieces of the Milwaukee. Well, we don't want to get too complicated here, but the Milwaukee Main Line has now become the Sioux Line and Canadian Pacific Main Line between Twin Cities and Chicago. And it's a first-class main line, runs down the river. The Sioux Line then sold off some of its trackage to an independent short line, the Wisconsin Central. This was after I left the Sioux Line. Because the Sioux Line had this first-class main line now of the Milwaukee's and also all of the Milwaukee's tributary trackage. So it was an upgrade for the Sioux Line, no question about it. I spent a year after the argument in February of '85, I'm pretty sure that date, staying at the Sioux Line, but by that time I knew I had to move on. But I worked finishing up the deal, getting all the loose ends tied up, the assets, determined which assets were rail-related and not rail-related. And there was a lot of litigation and a lot of argument about that, but we got that done too.
I'm not sure we got on tape the anecdote about the judge in his comment at a breakfast meeting or something.
Oh, no.
Breakfast, but in Sal Santoro's glee when he said, "If I had to rule today."
Yeah, that happened. The bankruptcy judge had I think it was every Monday morning, he had a session just to do business, do the Milwaukee bankruptcy business.
What was his name again?
Judge McMillan. And on that day, the trustees and the trustees' counsel, Bob Wheeler, who became a friend also, but would come in, and there would always be lots of miscellaneous matters to be decided, to be dealt with, to be talked about. And so we very often went to those Monday morning hearings because as this matter was evolving, we were getting close to the climax of it. We wanted to know what was going on. So Sal Santoro and I quite frequently went to these Monday morning sessions to see what was happening. And of course the trustee, Ogilvy, the trustees' council, the Northwestern, they all came in and sat down at the same table. It's sort of like they were the same team, but they weren't supposed to be. It was one of the attempted purchasers. And the judge was intoning about something or other, and it didn't have anything to do with the merger as such, except I can't even remember the issue, but he said, because if I had to rule on who should acquire the Milwaukee today, I'd award it to the Sioux Line. And that was completely unexpected. And he didn't have to say that. and of course,
It's a little bit almost unprofessional in a way, or out of
well,
the kind of.
judges have a lot of power. They can
Yeah.
say what they want, and anyway, you could have heard the jaws drop all around the room. You could almost hear him hitting the table. And Sal Santoro and I looked at each other with big grins. And he's Italian, so he's a little more enthusiastic than I was. I'm Scandinavian, but he was almost getting up and jumping around in the chair, but we had to be cool.
Yeah, I was going to say, you must have had to try and hide it.
Anyway, it was fun. So that was up to that point, we'd clearly been the underdog. When you have $200 million less on the table, it's hard to imagine a bankruptcy judge awarding it to someone for less money. But this public interest issue and we capitalized on it. We emphasized that, made a
Sometimes
point of
the
it.
good guys win. I
True.
wanted to ask what it was like to like in this world of lawyers and stuff. What's it like just in an everyday? What's the dynamic like between your opponents and people like you said that you had squared off against before with the Chicago Northwestern? You had was
Mhm.
is it like openly? I'm sure it's not. It's professional and it's not antagonistic. But is there any kind of awkwardness, or is it
Not particular.
difficult?
No, in fact, in all my railroad litigation, we're all part of the railroad industry. Excuse me, a railroad industry or fraternity. There's a sense that there's a bond there, and nobody talks about it. And we all know we're going to have to be meeting each other again and again. So we better not just get into a spitting contest or try to make enemies. In fact, I really never saw any of that happen among railroad lawyers. They always were very civil. They knew tomorrow would come and we'd have to be, and tomorrow we might be allies. That happened frequently. One day we'd be fighting them, next day we'd be allies in a completely different proceeding. So there really wasn't, it was not hard to get along with them or deal with them.
Would you ever say have dinner or drinks with people that you were fighting against?
Well, sometimes, yeah,
Mhm.
that happened.
And then
You
you
know,
put it
if-
aside, or would you talk business in a situation like that sometimes?
Probably you wouldn't. Well, sometimes you could talk about the case because you had things to work out. You were trying to maybe settle something, and so that was sure a fair game too. But and by and large, we quite often had dinner together and just with these, because I had dealt with these people for years. I mean, the Northwestern attorney, Stu Gassner, we'd had many cases in which sometimes we were on the same side, sometimes we were on opposite sides, but we were good. We were friends, but we could complain about each other away when we're not in the presence of them. But still, in all, it was a functioning, a good professional relationship as far as I was concerned. We didn't waste time being idiots and jerks just for that sake. We wanted to get. We knew we had to get things done.
I can hear this, so just try not to. When you do this,
Oh, okay.
yeah, just try.
I'm not wringing my hands
Don't
with
fidget too
agony.
much.
Don't fidget. Well, then I left the railroad business, or I thought, when I left the Sioux Line, I ended up with a large local law firm.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
When I started in the railroad industry in 1967, when you joined a large corporation, you entered into a compact. The corporation, as long as you did your job and performed up to expectations, the corporation would stick with you. You could count on a place for your entire career. It was a much more stable environment than it is today, where people change jobs every 6 months just for a few bucks. So when I got to the Sioux Line, again, I was looking. I didn't want an insecure position. I wanted to go someplace where I could finish out my career doing what I like to do. Well, the pace of change was accelerating, and then I had this problem with Kavanaugh, and so finally I had to admit that for my own sanity, I couldn't stay there. And indeed, Kavanaugh did not last more than another year or two after I left. The board of directors finally got fed up with him because he had axed so many people just because, and he created a very unsettling corporate culture. But I was out on the street basically. I certainly didn't welcome that, but I had a year's severance pay, so I decided I'd look at everything that I never thought I wanted to do, including teaching college at a college level. I had envisioned myself possibly teaching transportation history, something I knew quite a bit about by that time. But I went and talked to my old, one of my history profs who I admired greatly, Clark Chambers. He still lives up here in the retirement home just 2 blocks from here. And in fact, I went and visited him there and told him my idea. See, at that time I I don't think I was even 50 yet. Well, I may have been. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. I still had a 15-year career ahead of me.
Yeah, you were just over 50, it looks like.
Yeah.
85.
So, but after Chambers reviewed, well, you'd have to go back and get your PhD. You can't. Your law degree won't count, and that's 3 or 4 years of very penurious living. And then you've got to try to get a teaching job, and you'll get paid $20,000 a year. I mean, at that point, I was making $100,000 a year, so that didn't look too attractive. So I soon disabused myself of go back to the groves of academia.
I didn't know you'd ever thought about teaching. It's very
And
interesting.
I looked at several other things, but eventually concluded that I should stay in law, especially transportation law, if I could do it, because that's where my expertise was and interest was. And I have eventually found a spot with Fellhaber, Larson, Fenelon, and Vogt, a good law firm as it turned out, where I worked for the rest of my career until I retired in 1999. And I was able to develop a reasonable railroad practice within that firm, even though they had little other prior experience in that. But at that time, there were a lot of new short line railroads forming, and so there was a lot of work to be done helping them get their feet on the ground and get their place in the industry.
Did you bring all this business in for them, pretty much?
Well, some of it, yeah. We ended up with a fairly healthy client at Fellhaber, and Bill Eklund, a guy who had one of the senior partners I had known, and he helped me get into the firm because he had a railroad client of his own. But we got as a client the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern, which was a new regional railroad that had been spun off by the Northwestern. And they were growing, and they were becoming a fairly serious player. So we were acted as general counsel. I was really, in effect, their general counsel for several years. And then they got a change of management, a change of direction. Some of the key people we'd worked with retired, so we had to move on from that relationship. But for several years, that was a good client. It was the second biggest billing client for our firm for a couple of years.
That doesn't have anything to do with Greg Haug's
No,
line.
no. Yeah, I should mention that. Might as well mention that because I did a lot of work in the industry, but not too much that was a major category, what I would call a major category. But toward the end of my time at the Fellhaber firm, I was approached by Greg Haug, who was a Soo Line employee, and I had met him, but hadn't really become friends back when I was still at the Soo Line.
What did he do there?
He was head of grain. He had become head of grain marketing. Grain was his field. He knew that business backwards and forwards. And the Soo Line is a big grain hauling railroad. Still is. Well, he came to me. Said the Soo Line was interested in leasing to him about 400 miles of trackage for him to operate as a short line railroad. I wanted to know if I would help him negotiate the deal. And I had a little hesitation getting involved in that. So he and I negotiated a lease with the Soo Line, became good friends, and he started his railroad up about 11 years ago now. This was just before I retired, about 97, 98. And he's been very successful. He's done a great job, and he's grown the railroad, added to it. It's been a complete success story in every possible way. And he's become a good friend, and I'm still involved with him doing some work for him. So,
How much time since you retired? I mean, obviously it wasn't a full-time job for you working on that, but can you say what kind of percentage of your time that you spent working on this
Well,
railroad, or
we negotiated the deal while I was still at the Fellhaber firm before I retired. He was a client, basically. And that took several months of, tough wrangling. And at the same time, the people at the Soo Line knew me because I'd, run the law department a few years before. And I thought we might have some problems, but Kavanaugh was long gone. And so, frankly, apparently the reputation I'd made at the Soo Line was not a bad one because we had good success, good cooperative success. We made a good deal, and Greg has run a very good railroad since then as a result of that.
were any of the lawyers that were with the Sioux Line when you were negotiating for Greg? Had you worked with them when you were?
Oh, yeah,
on staff?
the guy that was negotiating on the other side used to work for me when I was at the Sioux Line. And then after I left, Kavanaugh had put him in charge of the law department. So
And he was still
he was still there,
in
yeah.
charge?
But that worked okay. Anyway, I haven't skimmed my recent.
Do you want to take a break for a sec?
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, we could go back on the air.
All right.
Doing work for the, while I was at Fellhaber for the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern, the DM&E was, had some interesting things that made it interesting, I should say, because it's the railroad that runs through Tyler. And I'd watched that railroad decline over the years, and then the DM&E took over the trackage, and then it began to fix it up and turn it around. That was kind of fun. And I knew the territory a little bit too, so that always helps. I always tried to familiarize myself as much as possible with a client's business so that I could speak more knowledgeable about it when it came to writing briefs and going to court. Also, the DM&E was owned by a number of investors in England. Unlikely enterprises such as the British Coal Board Pension Plan, something like that. And they were represented in this country by a small investment firm in San Francisco. So we ended up having all of our board meetings in San Francisco. That was kind of cool. So I got a lot of trips out to the Bay Area as a result of that.
You traveled a lot, didn't you, in general?
Yeah, I sure did.
You,
I think I'm going to make a list of all the cities I've gone to.
just got that log, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's all here.
Did you enjoy it, or did you get sick of it?
Oh, I enjoyed it usually. In fact, I took advantage of when I got, just as an example. Are we on the air? When I was started out with working for the railroad, I had a meeting in New Orleans, so I took the train to New Orleans. Took the Panama Limited. That was a great experience. And another time I had a hearing in Salt Lake City, so I flew to Omaha. This was in 1969 when the passenger train network was dying. And the California Zephyr, one of the great trains, was still running, but on its last leg. So I flew to Omaha and took the California Zephyr to Salt Lake City over the Rockies. It's the most scenic part of its ride. That was another great little experience. But it was all in the line of duty. I was on my way to a hearing. It just took a little longer.
But it took longer, and that wouldn't set today.
No, that didn't bother anybody at the railroad. In fact, there was my predecessor at the Great Northern. He did a lot of the ICC work. His name was Elmer Truesdale. Good guy, and he decided to go with a private firm. We don't need to go into that. But he didn't like to fly. So quite frequently, if he had a meeting in Washington, say on a Wednesday, he would get on the train Monday morning, go to Chicago, take the overnight train to Washington, D.C., and he'd always go a day early in case there was some problem with connections. He would spend a week going to a one-day hearing or meeting in Washington, D.C., just to do it by train. Also, when
I suppose you could get some work done while you're writing.
well, you get a lot of work. I would fill my briefcase with reading and files to go over, and yeah, it was never wasted time for me. But also, about the time I got active on doing some more serious matters for the Great Northern, they bought a corporate jet, and the Northern Pacific had already bought a corporate jet, so the Great Northern could not sit still and let the Northern Pacific buy a jet and they not get a jet. So, and the Northern Pacific jet had 2 engines, so they had to get a corporate jet with 4 engines, so they bought a Jetstar.
Wow. Did you travel in that?
Oh, lots. We could.
I can't remember that.
So if I had an out-of-town meeting and I had several people that had to take along to it, or a hearing, I could request the plane and get the plane,
Wow.
and I did so many times.
That must have been nice.
There's another little vignette that I like to share, and in looking back, I see that Tony Kane obviously really liked my work, and because he started doing things for me that he wasn't doing for other people in the department. I think I mentioned earlier that he sent me to this week-long Brookings Institution on learning about the government. And another time, stop me if I've mentioned this, Hubert Humphrey had been nominated for president on the Democratic ticket. And of course, I thought of most of the corporate nabobs as being Republicans at heart, but Tony knew that you had to have an entree to both sides of the political fence. So he never took sides publicly. He always treated both sides with respect and listened to them, and they would in turn listen to him. And I ended up doing a fair amount of lobbying too. But Tony said he had got 2 tickets to I think it was the inaugural banquet on the occasion of Humphrey getting nominated for president. Of course, he knew that I was acquainted with Humphrey. Everybody's acquainted with Humphrey, but they really were. And so he got the company Jetstar and flew. He and I were going to fly to Washington to go to this banquet. But on the way, we flew to the Gaspé Peninsula in Rimouski, Quebec, to pick up the president, John Budd, and his wife, who had been birding out there. So we landed at a dirt strip in the wilds of Quebec, picked up the Budds, who were very nice people too, and they flew with us to Washington. One of those wonderful experiences where I got to meet. This was within a year after I'd started working for the company.
It was the president of what?
Great Northern.
Yeah. So what was Tony?
He was the vice president of law, or vice president of general counsel, the chief legal officer. So that was fun too, and I got to meet the Budds, and I had already met John Budd. He was very, very. I mean, the people of the Great Northern are just top shelf and beyond. And it was a very formative period of my life. I learned that how good an organization could function. But meanwhile,
Well, what about, unless you had something else you were going to go into, you haven't talked at all about your political career either, or brief though it may have been. I mean, when did that all figure in?
that was really before I went railroading.
Yeah.
But the fact that I had been active politically helped me in the railroad business, because I ended up doing a lot in the government relations department. In fact, Tony knew that I had credibility on the Democratic side of the aisle, and so I was often involved, because there were often more Democrats in office than there were Republicans in those days. And so I never felt compromised, because frankly, the railroads that I worked for never were trying to pull wool over anybody's eyes. Their course was an honorable one. And indeed, as the environmental movement began to develop, which it did in the 70s, I found myself having more and more environmental cases that I was handling. The railroads were on the side of the angels. They polluted less. They were more efficient than trucks in terms of energy consumption. By and large, the railroads were in a good position. They were, as I said, on the side of the angels, so to speak. Other pieces of my career that may have gotten overlooked, we're jumping around now. There may be no other way to do this instead of trying to keep it strictly chronological, but one of the things I got involved in after I left the Sioux Line and was with Fellhaber Larson was I got involved in a couple of railroad bankruptcies. One was a short line in Terre Haute, Indiana, which Chico Clark, our friend, had put some money into. So they went into bankruptcy. The guy who was running the railroad was really inept, and so I was, and you had to appoint a trustee in every railroad bankruptcy, no matter how small the railroad was. And this was a pretty small railroad. So I, for several months, tried to manage this little railroad in Terre Haute. I was flying down to Indianapolis and driving over to Terre Haute every week or so. But it proved to be basically unsavable, so eventually we put it into liquidation. I was never able to generate any significant new business for it, so we put it into liquidation, and then turned it over to a local Indiana lawyer to sell it off. But for one brief shining time, I sort of had my own railroad. And I also got involved with a railroad bankruptcy in Colorado, which is, I think I've mentioned that already. It was my first exposure to southern Colorado. This was the Colorado and Wyoming, a railroad subsidiary of CF&I Steel Company in Pueblo. And that's really was my first exposure to the part of the country where we now have built a cabin.
When was that?
That was in the early 90s.
Was that what made you interested in property then, or?
Yeah, it started giving me a familiarity with that. You know, I was impressed with the winter climate. I remember being out in Pueblo in January and February and staying there for several days, and it might snow at night, but then by the middle of the next afternoon it was 50 degrees and sunny. And I thought I could learn to live with a winter like that. But the 90s were filled with smaller matters. The DM&E was a major client for several years. That was the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern. But otherwise, it was more, this is while I was in private practice. It were smaller matters, many of them railroad related. So I basically kept my hand in, you might say, until I retired in 1999. After which I continued to do some railroad matters. I wasn't trying to stay in practice. I was just simply trying to keep my hand in on some interesting matters. But even in looking over my chronology, there's some other highlights you might be interested in. One is, I put my personal trips in here too. And in 1968, right after I started with the Great Northern, Alice and I went to Europe and spent 2 weeks with Nan and Enoch traveling around. It was a great visit, great trip.
Did we stay with Bodkers or something?
Yes, you did. Yeah. Then there was another, and then in 1974, the whole family went to Jamaica. You probably can remember that.
Yeah.
And we even managed to ride on a train in Jamaica.
That's like movies.
Then in 1978, you and I went to Europe and traveled around for a week by train, and then met Alice and Carla in Rome with Gregersons. That was another great trip. You were, I kind of wore you down maybe, but
I was jet lagged. I remember when we were traveling. When we were doing the rail pass stuff.
yeah, that got pretty. But you were a good sport and stayed the course.
I didn't have any choice.
Well, maybe you weren't a good sport.
Well, I don't know. You tell me. If you say so, then that's good.
Yeah.
How many cross-country road trips did we take? Seems like we were always doing it, but I know we took some train trips, we took some car trips to see Bodkers and the Northwest.
Yeah, I could, and I can pick them out of my log. Oh, you know what? I wasn't putting auto trips in my logs at first, but by 1992 I was. Here I show going to Solvang in February of '92. Then here's and do you remember in 1971, I think it was just before Amtrak took over, we all took the train out to Seattle, and then my dad, mom went along
Yes.
at the last minute. That was a famous trip. And then we came back by train.
Pops went on a different route.
Yeah, he got sidetracked, so to speak. Leading to an often told story of Railroad Misadventures. Here's a
You might as well tell it.
here's something in 1992. Here's a obviously well, it doesn't say it was a vacation trip. Train and rail. I don't know what was going on. Oh, we went to the Caneos River Valley, which is near. It's near the San Luis Valley, near where our cabin is now.
And it's just been you and Mom, of course.
What does I didn't say who was on there. I usually mark non-business, but I didn't mark it anyway.
You know, I was doing something done then.
Yeah, you were long gone. By 1993, I'm still traveling quite a bit. This is now with the law firm. But here's a trip to England. When Alice went over there, spent a couple of weeks by herself, looking at art, going to Grisdale Forest, and I joined her. And in the course of that, I went to the Isle of Man myself for the 100th anniversary of the Manx Electric Railway. And while there, it says this is an electric railroad that's still in operation, hauling passengers every day. And on that visit in '93, I rode in one of their original cars, which is still in everyday service, a 100-year-old interurban car. That was kind of cool. So we got to do along the way we've managed to do a lot of interesting things. So life should be that way. You asked about writing.
Well, that's kind of your main occupation nowadays, right?
Yeah, except I haven't written any. I write a column for a Old Cars newspaper, but I haven't done a book for a year and a half, 2 years. But I've done a total of 9 books, and I did them pretty much after I retired for the first few years. And most of them were governed by my access to suitable photographs to support it, because whether it's a car book today or a train book, you really need to have a lot of good photographs. And if you don't have a good pictorial base to talk about or to focus people on, it's hard to do a book that sells or that's very interesting to people. But that was, lawyers, at least as a lawyer, always felt that writing was my major craft, expressing myself concisely and clearly. And I worked very hard all my career to do that, because lawyers quite often get just carried away by their own verbosity. And they think because they can fill the air with words that somebody is listening to it. But that doesn't necessarily produce good communication. And so that's one of the things I worked at. And so I fancied myself a good craftsman of the word and tried to do my books the same way. And I still try to do my columns. I've done over 60 columns now for the Old Cars Weekly.
Do you have them collected in one place? Or
Yeah, I've got them all.
are they
They're basically
computer, or are they just? Do you have the published?
Well, I have that, and I have my original drafts. And many of them are still on my computer, but not the one I just tried to
What are the original
get.
drafts if they're not on your computer? They're just typewritten or hard
Well,
copies?
they're my hard copy, really, of the finished column. And then I usually when it gets printed in the paper, I print it just to remember what it looked like, because I always have to produce a couple of photographs to go with it. And so that's been fun. Again, that kind of keeps my hand in.
Did you script your arguments? I mean, I know you weren't in court all the time or that much, but
Well, in my later years, I didn't try a case to a jury. I didn't do much of that. I don't think I did a jury case for quite a long time. But there are many court appearances for motions, for seeking relief other than a final judgment. And yes, when you're arguing an appeal, you have to be careful what you say and be thoroughly prepared on all issues that may come up. So yes, I didn't I never wrote out a tight script because it was always better for me to, I got to make this point and put it in words as I go along. When you're in an appellate court argument, the judges can interrupt you and do any time, just bust into your train of thought. So if you got a script, you can't possibly deal with the judge's questions, and you got to deal with them, and it's very hard to get back on the track if you were tied to a script.
You said you had to be adaptable, but
Yes, indeed so.
did you write out bullet points or something?
Oh, sure. I had various ways I'd try. It depends on the kind of a case, too. Sometimes you've got a dense factual situation that you have to present accurately. Other times you just have some argument points that you have to be sure you make. So each case varies widely. I've always enjoyed the dynamic of working in the railroad industry because, you know, it's by definition, it's a moving industry, and there's lots of things happening, and I love that aspect of it. And as a result, got to do a lot of train riding over the years, including cab rides and good stuff. I've been on railroad lines that I never would have gotten near as a private citizen, not involved with the industry. Another thing that's enabled me to apply that interest has been I've been a member of the board of directors of the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, which has one of the best railroad artifact collections in the country, and actually has its own operating railroad now. And it's been very satisfying and very rewarding, not financially, I don't get paid anything for it, but rewarding to me to stay involved with a lot of active railroaders who are on the board with me, and just a lot of trains and railroad history to present and to enjoy and to live with. So it's been another particularly good part of my life.
Is that in Duluth?
It's in Duluth in the railroad station. Have you ever been there?
I think I went there once with you a long time ago.
Yeah, it's worth another trip, but 22-mile railroad line that goes to two harbors, which the museum now operates for tourists or during the summer months, and that's pretty cool. You want to?
First, do you want to mention your retirement party and how that performance that took?
Yeah. Well, along the way, I've met some people who really know their way around the railroad industry, even though they're not part of it. One is Dirk Lenthe, who is still a good friend. He's the sort of the ultimate rail fan. He's actually owned, at one point, half a dozen or more real railroad passenger cars, some of which he ran in service around the country chartering trips. Well, when my retirement decision was finally made in 1999, he and another friend, Craig Engels, wanted to have a retirement party for me. Sorry about that. And so Dirk managed to line up two railroad private cars, one of which he owned, another which he borrowed from a railroad. I mean, I don't think he paid anything for it. And then he got permission to run a private train on the Wisconsin Central from New Brighton, Minnesota, all the way to Chippewa Falls and back. And so this train consisted of a freight locomotive and two railroad business cars, which had open platforms, and they were placed back to back, so there was an open platform on both ends, and we had a room for about 50-some people. I think that's about what we had that came along, all by invitation, and they had arranged for wonderful refreshments, and this was just bowled me over because they had arranged so that the engineer would stop the train anywhere we wanted to. And anybody could go up and ride in the cab that wanted to. So everybody got a chance to experience real rail fanning. And it was great for all my friends, a lot of whom didn't know anything about railroads or care, but they got a taste of it, what I liked. And that was important to me. So that was a highlight, one other life highlight.
What would you say the highlight of your career was? Is it that what we started with today, the
Well, in terms of
Milwaukee Road?
accomplishments, that Milwaukee Road acquisition was the big one. That was probably that was a $500 million asset purchase transaction. May have been the biggest one up to that point in history.
Wow.
But the next day life moves on, and that all gets forgotten. But it was we had a lot of things to put together, and we managed to do it. So it was a real achievement.
Any regrets or disappointments or?
Well, there's always a number of disappointments. It's too bad that things went sour at the Sioux line, but on the other hand, I had some good experiences after that, and so your life. I guess basically, I sort of changed jobs every 10 years roughly, and that was good. That was healthy. It made for variety, and it all worked out pretty well.
So it's 10 years after your retirement. What's your next job going to be?
Well, I'm trying to really be retired now. Sit on my butt.
Maybe that could be it. You'll actually retire and play with cars.
But being involved with Greg Haug has continued to be very rewarding, and he's the first railroad CEO that I've ever worked for that really appreciates my contribution, and he's made that plain, and he's rewarded me too. So that's been very satisfying to climax my career with that kind of a relationship and that kind of success.
What kind of stuff do you do for him now, or most
Well,
recently?
we have. I'm on. He has a board of directors. He owns the whole railroad. So the board of directors are friends that he's worked with over the years in the railroad industry. 3 of us, plus his dad, who we sit down from time to time, once a year for sure, and just look at how he's doing and critique him, give him some suggestions, respond to, should I do this? Or does this make sense to you? And we're all good friends. We've all worked with him for years, and we speak straight to him, and he appreciates that. He's a very positive guy. He doesn't. He's not looking for ways to, view things negatively, I guess. So, and that's been very rewarding. We still do that every year.
Is he an owner, or does he go in to the office every day? Is he an operating officer too? Or?
Well, he doesn't. Had done a good job of building up a really good quality staff, and so the day-to-day operation is pretty much done by them. But he spends a lot of time out in Fordville, North Dakota. That's the intergalactic world headquarters of the Northern Plains Railroad. But he's got an office in Duluth where he lived, and now he's doing a lot of remote control management from his new home in Mason City, Iowa, where his new wife is from. And so, and he's also, he loves sailing. And he just spent, he and Kim, his wife, spent 6 weeks on Lake Superior in their new trawler. They'd dock in one port for a few days, and then they'd move on to another one, and just enjoying the lake.
Nice life.
Yeah, I went over to visit them, see his new trawler, one of those ports of call. Anyway,
That's a sail boat?
he has always had sailboats. He still has a sailboat, a 2-masted one. It's a pretty good size. It must be 30 feet or more. And he's had that for years, and he really enjoys sailing. And
Is that what we went on?
probably is, yeah.
That was fun.
And one of his good friends, who's also on the board, John Winkler, has sailed with him for years. So they both enjoy it very much. And but now he bought a trawler. I think which is a motorized. It's like a big cabin cruiser. Only it's not meant to go fast. It's just meant to be comfortable, and I think it's 45 feet long. It's got twin Cummins diesels, and it's a serious ship. So his tastes are changing too, I guess, or maybe his new wife is a factor in this. Who knows? But he's a good guy, and it continues to be great fun to work on projects with him. For example, I'm going to Texas in a few weeks for an annual meeting that BNSF holds with all their short line connections. And we're considered one because we bought a couple of lines, branch lines from the BN and hooked them onto Greg's former Sioux line network. And I've continued to work with him on these line acquisitions and negotiations. And we've got another one pending now that we may be able to pull off. And they've been very successful. So he's growing a business in an unlikely place, northern North Dakota.
Oh, there's a lot of grain up there, I would think.
This is wheat country up
Yeah,
there.
okay.
And ironically, I found out that Greg is allergic to wheat, so that's,
So he's not the engineer?
well,
Is Rowan? There's Mom.
well, let's wrap it up. I
Bye,
gotta change clothes and.
Sorry.
Give him a kiss.
Okay, if I have to.
I'm just gonna go change clothes and go to 4:30 Club.
Ready?